Hi, folks. This is Inspect and Reflect. I was on the one 2 weeks ago talking about Adobe's Spectrum design system, and this particular week we're going to be talking about Nord. But before we get started, I want to introduce these speakers that we have today. We're going to go down the line. Beatriz, could you tell us all about yourself and what kind of expertise you're going to be bringing to our table today?
I cannot tell you everything about myself.
I want it all.
Okay. So I'm Beatriz. I'm a senior systems designer at Bumble. Right now, what we're doing is just pretty much working on all the components and make sure that they are all adopted within iOS and Android, because that's what our platform mainly is about. I've worked with big companies like Santander, AT&T, McKinsey and Company. So all of those have been a challenge because each one of them, it's a different design system. It's different things, different blow-minding questions and things to work around. So I want to bring to the table pretty much everything that I know for all of those organizations. Each one, as I said before, it's different. So I think there's a lot of value there to understand how one product can be for web only or for app only, or the different nuances that we can have.
Thank you very much, Beatriz, and it's great to have you here and joining us. Davy, I want your life story. What do you got for us?
Oh, my life story. All right. So many years ago, I was born. I came to this earth and I got into design systems. So like pretty much right away, right? Like back in the 80s or something. I'm Davy Fung, product designer at Meta, supporting enterprise design systems. I also have a podcast called Design System Office Hours. If you'd like, please check it out on any platform that you choose. Hopefully we'll be there.
Thank you, Davy. I appreciate that. Excellent. Maya, what's going on with you? Tell me about your expertise you're bringing to our table today.
Yeah, so I think starting with kind of the life story in design systems, I've been working in design systems for about 6.5 years now. I'm a product manager for design systems at REI. Cedar is the name of the design system if you want to check it out. REI is an outdoor retailer, so we primarily support our e-commerce website, but we do have some support in tokens and our mobile apps, as well as in internal tools that both our HQ employees and some of our retail employees use as well. I've been around since helping launch the MVP of the system and really driving a lot of the adoption, evolving the roadmap over time, prioritizing what goes into the system, working to track metrics and document every part of the system. So been around through a few different evolutions as the business needs changed, and really just focus on how we can keep adapting the system to stay relevant. Love looking at other really solid design systems as reference points and talking to other design system practitioners. So really glad to be part of this group and dive into this today.
Well said. Thanks for sharing that. Great to have you as well. Alex, bringing up the rear over here. What's cooking?
Hey everybody, my name is Alex Wilson. I am the Design System Engineering Manager at T. Rowe Price. T. Rowe Price is a financial services company. We're globally positioned, so we have to make sure our experiences work for all of the different locales. I'm mostly working on web experiences, touching on some of our mobile apps as well, but I've been with the firm since before the design system was introduced, so I saw it when there's a lot of isolation, tons of different color options, different designs for different parts of the sites, and a bit unorganized. Now, years later, after we've scaled out the design system, we're in a much better place. So I've seen the adoption of all of our components and the new variants we've had to introduce and the challenges we faced along the way. So I bring some expertise there, similar to Maya, from seeing it from the beginning. You can see a lot of the scaling challenges, and so that's a bit about me.
Super. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And last it's me. The thing I'm bringing to your table today is your New York attitude. That's all I'm bringing here today. But I do, of course, have some expertise in design systems. You might have heard me from 2 weeks ago talking about Adobe Spectrum with the crew that was on Infa last week. But I am founder and chief architect of Design Systems House. And the small thing that I'll plug is that I've been doing a live stream every Tuesday at 5 p.m., just taking about design and design engineering and stuff like that. Look at these hard eyes. My goodness. All right. There is a spot over on top over here that asks you folks to potentially introduce yourself and provide some insight into who you're about. You can take a photo over here, apparently, if you like. There's some stuff to check out as well that people have shared over here. So do take a look at that. While I discuss a little bit about the goal today. So our goal today, we're going to be inspecting and reflecting on how the Nord design system is used in Nord products, okay? Again, the goal here is not to critique what they've done here, because design systems are hard. I think many of us here in this event recognize that design systems are hard and people are still learning and still growing, and that's exactly what this is all about. And I think something I've commented on this meeting before is that this is really an interesting space, because all of us look at other design systems in the comfort of our own offices or our own desks to review what's going on out there. And this is a really great opportunity for us to do that kind of publicly and talk about the things that we're considering when building our own systems. So I think that's really cool as an event that is put together here. If you haven't already, you can, of course, join the community with the links that are happening over here. The next event, as you can see here, is talking about Microsoft Fluent's design system version 2, and that'll be in 2 weeks on March 6th. All right, and that should cover it for all the stuff over here. I'm sure Fareed will ping me and be like, no, you forgot something, and I'll find out about that later. But let us kick it off here. We do have a whole bunch of stuff that the Infa team has checked out in terms of its theory and guidelines from the Nord system. There's some product pages that were found, which looks like a whole bunch of marketing related stuff in here, which is okay. There might be a couple of product things that are stuck in here. But the first thing I wanted to get into, and it looks like it's already started up in here, is layout. And I think the person who was originally was talking about layout or wanted to discuss layout, was that you, Alex? Alex, did you want to speak about layout? What did you want to talk about that was interesting for you?
Well, I think Maya, you also were interested in this one. Did you want to kick us off there? See,
you're on mute there.
At the moment.
Yeah, sure. We can take a look at
thank
layout.
you. Yeah, fix my face there. If I got the wrong person in here, there's a lot of windows open over here. So please, Maya, go ahead.
No worries. Yeah, I think we were looking at this as one of kind of the juicy components that we haven't looked at in some of these previous sections. So yeah, just looking at the board here, looks like we pulled out some of the documentation. This looks to me more of the kind of page layout component. We have one that's more of like the page container. So this is something that our design system has been working on lately, like the generic container patterns and the different elements that goes into those. So it's interesting to see some of the different properties. Looking at the board here, I think one thing we realized when doing this audit is that a lot of the Nord Health products are like internal only, so we couldn't really get into those to audit. But what we pulled out here are some of the screenshots from the templates, which are also included on their page. And if you look through here, it looks like we have a couple different examples of those templates, all using this kind of basic 2-column layout pattern, right? They've got the sidebar on the left hand, different top bar elements, which is one of the sub elements of layout as well, where you can customize if you have the profile up there, if you have the search bar up there as well. Yeah, and it looks like it's a pretty slick view. I would be curious to see how it looks on smaller screens, but I would assume these are also primarily desktop use cases. So I don't know. I'm just looking around at the top level here. Could
I ask you something about this? Is that the layout is actually, especially a layout as this, is a very, I guess, highly composed component, right? There's a lot of stuff that can go in here. Is this something that you think, I don't know, I'm not familiar with your system necessarily, but is this something that you would think that your teams might be beneficial to have in your system to be able to compose a layout like this?
Yeah, I think there is certainly benefits to it, especially when you look at some of the properties. The value that we see is being able to consistently apply those to wherever this layout may be implemented. So whether you want to, like I mentioned, the top bar heading in there and the padding state around the different sections, if you want to be able to change those holistically, I assume they have a lot of shared properties under the hood there. And so that becomes a lot easier to give that kind of visual consistency by being able to have that base underlying parts, even though a lot of times it's one of those invisible components, right? It's like the layout, the container, the box that they all go into. And so what really matters is the spacing between elements and how flexible they can be composed within them, to your point, Donnie. Although, again, they have these kind of beautiful templates where it looks like they've already pre-composed a lot of that, and then you can really tailor it by use case.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting seeing something that does repeat as a layout. In my experience, I've seen lots of different applications that have lots of different layouts. You'll have same application, right? But some will have a sidebar, some will have a top bar, some maybe not have a bar at all. So I really appreciate them kind of identifying the reuse of the entire layout, which I think is unique among systems. Is there anywhere else? I know I got a couple of hands here. Is there any other systems here that are on the panel that have a layout in there? Maybe we'll go with Alex, because I did call it Alex earlier.
We don't have layout components currently, but I really love the structure of this type of component because I think a lot of the times it's handled with the utility classes, which we do have to handle grid and spacing and to kind of structure the different parts of the page. But I think the value here is that the components are driven by slots. So I think there's benefit through the web component technical architectures that they've used. If you put something in one of those slots and say the design changes and you don't want that panel on the right-hand side, and you say you want it on the left, may not make sense for Nord's design system, but just generally speaking, then you could just shift that over with CSS without having to, with an upgrade, where people will upgrade to the latest version of your library, without having everyone have to refactor all of their CSS utility class usage to make that happen. So I think there's a lot of value in scalability of solutions like this, and I'd be interested to see where other design systems take this type of pattern to multiple types of templates, because I think there's one main template here or one main layout.
Yeah, I agree. That is a good question. I would be interested to see how they recompose these things. Beatriz, do you have something to add here?
Davy, you had your hand raised first, so go ahead for it.
Yeah. I'm thankful that you folks are paying attention to this stuff because again, very
Beatriz,
overwhelming. Not much going on.
I'll go right
Davy,
after you.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, I'll go. Yeah, I was just gonna add that since this is layout specific, I have to, I'm another monitor here looking at what we have on our system here. I would like to see Nord does a really good job of listing dependencies that are component based. I think for layouts, there's much more like primitive dependencies. So like Alex and Maya said, a nod towards spacing. Granted, in this specific example, there's mainly one layout, which is like a header with a left-hand navigation, but potentially you might have a panel layout or maybe a modal layout. And depending on different layouts, you might have different spacing for like padding and such. So it would be good to lay that out. Another thing, and it shows on like the layout page, but then on subsequent pages too, it would be really helpful for designers to see visual examples of the slots and how that sort of scaffolds together. A big focus on the Nord documentation is the code examples and going through those, but I didn't see any sort of breakdown of like anatomy. So like for this page, there could be an anatomy of layout and what might be like in this. So like at the header, left nav, another action bar sort of thing, cards, etc.
Yeah, that's a really good call out there because I did see the documentation for layout as well. And it seemed to be like there could be a lot of things that you need to know. And it seems like it's a little bit, I don't know, it doesn't tell you all those parts, like the anatomy, like exactly you were saying there, Davey, that you would like to know some of the parts that you could put in there and options and things like that. I like that feedback there. Beatrice, go ahead.
I was going to say that, for example, I find this component very interesting for some sort of dashboards and even for Facebook, for example, Davey, I think this would be great in my perspective. But then, for example, for Bumble, we don't really need it. It's a mobile first app. And mainly like the only things that are similar between one page and another is just the nav bar and the tab bar. And even those, they sometimes change. So for us, this is not really needed, although I find this very useful for spacings as well, and just making sure that everything is aligned with the design that you want and the UI and the visual design that you have there. And as Alex mentioned, for example, if you want to change the sidebar from one place to another, if this is a layout component already, then this would transition to this new layout that you want. But also, if you check the design system that they have, the web page, on the layout, they also have like a lot of interesting variants. For example, they have something called drawer, which includes more stuff on the right side of the screen, but also just something to mention. For example, like it looks beautiful on web, but then when you make the component shorter and smaller, it doesn't work that nicely. So it's interesting that we're talking about North as like this amazing design system, but then they have a few things that don't really work well. So it's interesting to see this.
Yeah, great mentions on there. And I especially like the call out about how this component might not be something that would work in Bumble based on the needs of the business and things of that nature. It's important that a design system reflects its people and the needs of its people. And I think what's happening here for Nord in particular is that they've identified that this layout is something that their people need, and therefore as a resource in the design system. I lost where my people are here. Okay. Oh, Alex has his hand up. Fantastic. Alex, what are you going on here?
Beatriz, I like what you said there. I think there's definitely places, even at the top tier design systems, of where we can improve. And I saw one of the things that stood out to me was the usage section. And I know naming is super hard in general, but I do wonder if the name layout has gotten confusing for people within their company, because it says to visually group content in the layout section, use the card component. So I have a feeling like they must have gotten a number of cases where people tried to put they have we'll get into the card in a little bit, but they have a similar like header footer layout for the card, and then also like to lay out a smaller components use the stack component. And so are people using this to also lay out parts of the internal inner page design because they think it's supposed to help with just the layout, not really the template? So maybe template could be a better name for this type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But just a thought
Yeah,
there.
naming is hard. We all know it. So yeah, it's something we actually talked about the other week, was this idea of aliasing and trying to match a mental model. So trying to figure out what layout means to your organization could be a challenge. Maybe layout means something different to people who are starting, and you have to do that education. So definitely set in there. Maya, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just adding on that last point, I think it also comes down sometimes to just the sequencing of when components are built. If this was one of their early components, maybe they grab that layout name, and then, as Alex was saying, as they started to get more specific implementations, okay, how do we lay out specific elements within a part of the page? The names get stress tested there. And in our design system, we have kind of the opposite. Like, we just released a layout component that's really more of a layout within a component, like the stacks and the cards. And our kind of page level layout is more of just a container. But we wanted to use the container name for those. So the naming is hard, but it really, I think, comes down to just sequencing as well. And that makes it even more challenging sometimes to find the right level. But it is interesting to see across design systems, even just where we have consistency in naming, or where we can still see where some of that inconsistency comes through, and how we think about things.
100%. Yeah, trying to go across systems as we are trying to do today is definitely a challenge there. Oh, interesting. We have Beatriz, who has her hand up, and she'll probably mention something here, that the drawer version has a little bit a situation that happens if it had smaller. Obviously, this is hard, right? We were talked about earlier, right? Trying to do this stuff, sometimes catching the edge cases is hard. Beatriz, go ahead.
I was also going to mention that, for example, Alex was saying that maybe this shouldn't be named layout, it should be named templates, but for this specific component, I do find the naming actually quite good, at least on my perspective, because, for example, layout, it's just the simple stuff, or like the nav bar and the sidebar that they have there, and then the template, they include what's mainly like in the main board. So isn't it two different things for you, Alex? Just asking like randomly, but
it's a good point. It's a good point. What's the part? It is laying out the sections of the page. To that point, yes, the name is correct. And then I guess it depends on the definition of template and how far you take that. Is it like the different parts of the main section of the page? If that's included in the definition of the template, then that would be, I think, a separate thing. But you've got a good point there, and I'm not sure there's one straightforward answer, but it might depend on the company and what their needs are.
Yeah, and even like on the design system, right? As I mentioned before, like on Bumble, we don't need a layout. We directly go to templates because we find that much more useful and less time consuming than create like some sort of layout that is not really helpful, because we only have two things that repeat themselves sometimes. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea, thinking about what a layout really means again, like what they were talking about here is layout could be a purely visual thing. When we're really talking about, like, when from the code side, it'll eventually create a layout, but in the code, maybe that's a template. right? And even between the design and development, there are a difference of expectation there, or what we call a component, which is its own bag of fun times that I've tried to research myself. But is there anything else that we'd like to comment on the layout before we move on to the next component for the group here?
No, I
Okay.
just mentioned be careful with like responsiveness and try to
Oh,
do it
hell
as
yeah.
best as you can. Because yeah, I said before, something might look beautiful on web, but then when you make it smaller, it just breaks completely. And then since there's been like new phones on the market that are very slim, I think sometimes it's a little bit hard to put all the information that we have on a big screen like this one. So yeah, it might be hard for them as well to do this kind of layouts when like how do you put all of that information within such a small screen? But it's interesting that they have here like also the possibility of making it smaller and see how it works. Yeah, slimmer.
Yeah, 100%. It's sometimes easier to make like a button or a badge because the complexity is so much lower than it is for a layout, right? The layout is highly composable, lots of different moving parts, lots of places that edge and corner cases can come up, and trying to account for all that is a large task, right? And for such a large component, it is very easy for those things to come out and have to be addressed in lots of different ways. So a component like this being so large is why a lot of the reason why I wanted to choose it first, because it is unique and all the problems that can arrive from it. But I think Nord did a really good job supplying this thing to their people. I want to move over to input here, and looks like we have some stuff over here already, and Alex is already cooking in here. He's got this cursor ready to go. But I do want to call, I think, on Davy for this one, because the rest of the panelists were going back and forth on a couple of things to lay out. Davy, tell me a little bit about your insight into input and input design. What are you thinking on that?
Yeah, I think in general, what Nord has in terms of input seems like fairly common. It's not all that complicated. In terms of the slots, if you could go to the left and then just pan towards some of the slots I have. Very common has a label slot, a text slot like for hint, a validation slot, and there is a slot called like end. And I was trying to figure out my designer brain trying to be as engineering-y as possible. I was trying to figure out what else could be in this end slot content. An example of some of the inputs that are here at Meta, a thing that might be considered in the end slot might be like validation icon, close icon, undo or redo icons, other optional icons. But what I saw just in the cursory examples with looking through the templates, I think most of the time the end content slot is primarily for text and then just icons only. That's what I saw. Could an engineer on the call vet some of this assumptions?
Alex, you have some input on that for me?
I think that makes the most sense, Davey. I think you're right on there. I'm not sure what else would go at the end other than something like an icon, but I could see it. Yeah, I could see it working for, I don't know, if you had some type of indicator or something like that. But I'm sure it takes up like a portion of space on its own, and not just places like that item there, obviously, so you couldn't type over it and that type of thing. So it probably just blocks off that space for whatever you need it for. I suppose you could also maybe, if you had a design where it was an input matched up with some other functional piece, like a button, I do wonder if that would also be an option there. It might be a little bit odd of an odd pattern, but I would have to play around with it to see if it would sit within the input field itself or if it's attached to the input field as like that slotted area.
Yeah, that's a very common one I think here too, where we do have a prop that basically has a has button sort of thing, which is just a general CTA. You mentioned status. We commonly might have a status that's a part of an input as well. I think that's really common. Badging, which we might touch on today, might be part of this. So the end slot, I feel like is also much a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is a very loaded term and could mean a lot of different things. So it's somewhere where I would like to be a little more specific on what are the specific types of things, because your end user might end up trying to put anything and everything in there.
They sure would. Yeah, absolutely. The thing that comes to mind here for start and end for me is currency, right? Because certain currency signals go in the front of the number and some go in the back. So it's entirely possible to give a little bit more indication of what's going in this input. Maybe that's where a currency symbol would go. I did see a couple of hands. I think I have the order right. Maya, I think you were first. Is that correct? Go ahead and share.
Yeah, just building kind of, well, so I was like poking around after seeing the hint. I think similar on the layout and other docs, they really lean on that kind of demo at the top and those different examples in there. So I was looking at the couple different hints in there, and there's like a complex hint, and then there's like another hint, and then there's a hint prop and a hint slot. So it does feel like there's some potential for clarification in the documentation about which to use when and what is complex. It looks like maybe the word is bolded. But they have another example up there in the top too about units, and that looks like where it's depending like for size and currency, right? The other examples, you either have like the centimeters at the right side or the currency sign on the left side. So it seems like the lacking some of the anatomy and specific breakdown of these, really relying on kind of that top example and all the different variants in there, which then do provide like copy and paste code. And so that feels like really what they're expecting, or I wonder if that's what their consumers really rely on to see contextually some of these different examples where it's not explicitly written out in the documentation.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. Beatriz, I think your hand was next there.
From what I understand, also this component has like a slot for suffix and prefix. So I'd guess like you can actually put anything in there. Like I see a +1 there, like for the phone field, but if you could put anything, basically, like any other kind of component, which for me, it feels a little bit odd. I would simply make sure that they use 3 options in here, which might be the case, but it might not be the case because the documentation also, it does explain a little bit what you can put, a prefix or a suffix, but it doesn't really tell you what are the options there. Maybe that's something to take a look at and be careful with the options because it's like sometimes you might have a designer that can put anything, like even a card as a suffix or a prefix or something very odd. So yeah, I'd be careful with those kind of things and be sure to include those in the guidelines or even like on Figma, the way that you structure your component just for being practical, I'd say.
Really well said there. That talks about the threshold between locking down your system and being like, you can only do these things versus being open-ended and being like, you can do whatever you want. And where your system and your resources sit on that scale will have effects, right? Because if you allow for anything maybe in this kind of way, you could potentially see a badge in there, or maybe an input inside of an input. Let's go nuts. So it's entirely possible that bad things could happen because the guardrails aren't up, or the guidance isn't clear, or anything like that, where you could have lots of variation. But on the flip side, you could also have it so locked down that doesn't account for some of the use cases that you might have originally planned for. So finding your place on that scale is super important, I think. Alex, your hand is up.
Yeah, so my engineering mind's going towards the API right now. And I know, Maya, I think you mentioned the props and the slots. And so my thought is, okay, did one come first before the other? With our design system, we started off pretty prop heavy to begin with, and that locked down a lot of our components. And when we needed more flexibility, we decided to pivot to like props for behavior, slots for content or content type components. In this case, they have both props and slots for the same value. So then my thought is, okay, what's the complexity inside the component? Which is the default? If you add a prop and a slot by accident, which one's it going to pick? Then it also has the hide label option, which I think is good because it talks to the accessibility within the description there. But is that going to hide the slot and the prop? It seems like it's gotten pretty complex there, and they likely have, it feels like they might have users that leverage both, and it could be part of deprecation, but it could be part of a larger strategy. It's hard to tell based on what they have in their documentation here. But those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, and those are good thoughts there, Alex. I mean, Fareed actually had this question about props and slots, and basically asking, are they not the same thing? And this is actually really, from an engineering side, I think it could be interesting as a thing. So what is your take on props versus slots in terms of definitions?
Yeah, definitely can help answer that one. So properties, the way I look at it, it's like very locked down to a string of value, something you can pass in. And a lot of times you don't pass in HTML structures into a prop. Whereas with a slot, you can do whatever you want within that slot. You can add in a component. You could add in HTML. So you're really limiting your capabilities when you have a prop. So that's why we've chosen the behavior versus content route, because with behavior, you have a certain number of values that you'd pass in. You're not looking for flexibility in those values, but for slots where you could have a bunch of different type of content, or you could put in any types of components, you'd want that to be super flexible. So that's the breakdown I see of the two.
Thank you for that, Alex. Davey, your hand is up.
Oh, I was just going to go back and touch on Beatrice's example. So there's a good input that has a few items called units. I'm not very good at big jam, so I can't copy and paste and talk at the same time. But it would be good to have an example of what they mean by prefix and suffix as well, because I had thought prefix and suffix may be tied more towards like currency, like you mentioned, Donnie, or other types of units, kilometers or miles or that sort of thing. But I'm not sure it can mean anything. It could be an input that just has my name on it, and that's acceptable. And I think there's just a certain guardrails, like when, especially if your component library and the way that you work is very slot heavy, you want to be able to, I don't want to say lock it down, but give them a little bit more guidance onto what these should mean.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. The guidance is important there, especially if you're, again, opting to not lock something down and give a little bit of freedom. What does that freedom look like? And in many cases, we can't pick everything, but we definitely can give some guidance and show some people a good direction. Beatriz, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't really feel like a design system really locks you up, just gives you like more time to find other ways of doing the research or doing something else a little bit different. But touching on what you were saying before, Donnie, I also think guidance is important when there's a big design systems team or when there's like a big product team that uses these components or the design system daily. But if your team is small, do we really need those guidance? Because you're going to waste more time doing those guidelines than really designing for your company, right? Of course, I do understand North. They do need those kind of structures and guidelines to like all of the product designers to use. But for example, as we were mentioning before with the suffix and the prefix, I also think you should have a really good team not to depend on guidelines in case you don't want to use them. But if your team uses best practices and does know like the way to work with those components, maybe we don't really need them. So it's sad. I think it depends a lot on the team that you have, the best practices that they have, if they do follow the design system or not, what's the adoption of that design system. So I think that's also interesting when we're talking about guidance and guidelines of where to use some sort of thing. Maybe we don't know what's a suffix and prefix, but maybe internally they do know it, and that's why they don't need the guidelines for it. Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. That's right. It's maybe. I mean, you could have an internal knowledge in internal docs, right? It could be totally different from the internal versus the external. I'm sure some of us folks are familiar with that kind of idea where you have a different thing that's being shown to the public as opposed to what's happening internal, especially if you're doing different versions of stuff, right? Before we move on, I just for the group here, I see lots of props for the input here. And does anyone have some initial, when you see this like list of props? This isn't, again, meant to critique the props that are here particularly or the amount of them, but I personally look at this and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of props. Do you think that a list like this of configuration might be intimidating for people, or do you think this is something that just shows that there's lots of ways of customizing? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I actually do like that they have so many. From what I can see and what I've learned on the design system, they might have just one sort of base component that does it all, and then you can just simply hide or not the different props that we have there just to make sure that your input is the way you want it. We actually did the same thing at Bumble, like we have a lot of props just to make sure that we control everything with one base component and also with tokens. So that way, like inputs are the same everywhere. You want to make sure that they look the same everywhere. So if you change it on one place, you also want those inputs to change everywhere. So as having a base component with all these props, I do find it helpful, honestly, that to just have one thing for the phone field, another thing for, I don't know, the email, another one for blah, blah, blah. At least that's my input and what works for Bumble.
Yeah, definitely. I like the idea of being able to just pick a component and initially believe that's probably the component that you want, and then be able to configure it past that, as opposed to potentially having different components. Davey, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say I'm not intimidated by it because I like to have as much stuff spelled out as possible, but we certainly have received quite a bit of feedback in terms of the length of the properties on our documentation pages and being a little just possibly hard to interpret. And that might just be that there's just a variety of different types of engineers that encounter like our enterprise design system. So some of them are back-end engineers, some of them are full-stack engineers that just might not be as front-end focus. I still think there's a clear benefit to having them, but yeah, I'm scrolling through my code tab for my inputs page, and nearly half of my page is props also, so very similar to theirs.
Fantastic. And I see that I have some comment from Krista talking about it could be both, and curious about how tight Nord has constrained designers of the Figma library, and Beatriz is giving a comment about being able to potentially find the right base, right? And free to put more comments in there. I do want to move on, folks, and of course to take a peek at the comments at your leisure, but I do want to move on to the next component just so that we have a nice full understanding. And card, boy, oh boy, we love a good card here in design systems land. I do see Davy's hand is up and he is ready and willing and able to talk about this, but before we get to
I left my hand up by accident.
You did? Okay, sorry. I actually want to call on Maya because I haven't heard from Maya for a little bit in the last one. So Maya, would you have anything that you want to share about when we talk about cards here?
Yeah, I was just checking this one out, and it's interesting because I think it's a different use case for cards than how we look at it in our system and recent audit of design systems, where it's more kind of the media object where you have the big image on there, and it's more of a navigation element. And for this use case, again, design systems have to be really specific to the product that they're serving. They are these more functional tiles that I don't know that they always link, but they are used within a lot of these different use cases, like these larger tables. So maybe that kind of goes back to how we were talking about layout and what's the right level of kind of container component for these. I think in the examples here that we're looking at that are more from their marketing website, it's more of the standard card layout. But I wonder if those are actually using the ones from the system, and maybe Alex can confirm if you're shaking your head, because I didn't even see that in the examples, that sort of pattern there as well.
Yeah, Alex, go ahead and jump in.
Functional content grouping.
Looking at the code here, they're not using the component in the marketing sites yet. And I'm curious about that, but I definitely agree with you. This is more like a container component, it feels like, than like it contains content. That's pretty much their guidelines on the component. Then to what Beatriz was saying earlier, I think it ties really nicely into this component. You said, Beatriz, does this component need a lot of guidelines? I asked the question for this component, does this component need more guidelines around what you do with this tile? Because admittedly, I think for our design system, we have too many variants of our tiles, and we're looking to optimize that. But I think there's a middle ground where, you have some type of pattern or recipe as to what that tile should look like. What happens when you want a